Well, we're back now with our panel, and I can't think of a Sunday when we had more to talk about. We're joined by Gwen Ifill, who hosts PBS NewsHour and Washington Week, David Ignatius, of course, columnist for the Washington Post, who was reporting for us earlier this morning. Dave Gergen is with Harvard, and we want to welcome Carolyn Ryan to Face the Nation. She's the new Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. My, what an impressive, I don't know how I got invited to this crowd. This is, well, David, what's your take right now on where we are on this situation in Ukraine?
Well, I think the president, in going to Europe this week, did make some advances. He gave a good speech. I think he has bolstered things. He's done more than George W. Bush did way back when with Georgia. Having said that, as much as I detest Vladimir Putin, he's a thug, you have to acknowledge he's played his cards pretty shrewdly and pretty successfully from his point of view. Syria, we were on the verge of going in with military action. He offers a deal that we accept, and it keeps Assad, allows Assad to expand his power, not shrink his power. He goes into Crimea. Everybody says there are going to be consequences. The consequences are he's nearly pocketed it. He's basically it's sort of in his hands. Then we said, he paid a big price for this. He's diplomatically isolated. And today, we've got the Secretary of State turning around to go back and engage in negotiations with the Russians. That's some diplomatic isolation.
I mean, the parallels between this and the beginnings of World War I and also World War II are just striking. Yet we find the attitude in the United States right now is very much like it was before World War I. People don't want anything to do with this, according to the polls. They're not sure we should become even involved in it, Gwen.
One of the most interesting stories I read about this week was written by Robert Kagan at the Brookings Institution, which he pointed out that Americans in every poll show they want a light footprint. This is what they want. We're not isolationists exactly, but we don't really want to be we don't want to be boots on the ground anywhere. At the same time, the president's foreign policy ratings are going down. People look at him and they don't approve of his handling of foreign policy, even though he is carrying through that very ethos, which is we should be pulling back. So now the question is, what is the script? Is the script the Kerry Lavrov script in Paris? Is it the Obama-Putin phone call script on Friday in the Oval Office? And who's making the phone call? Who's not? Who's blinking? Who's not? And either way, I don't think that public opinion, especially in your second term, is going to be what drives the outcome.
I do think when you talk to people, I was reporting this through the weekend, if you talk to 20 different people within the U.S. government, you get 20 different interpretations of what Putin is really ultimately up to. And I think one of the problems, just in terms of reading the situation, is that he is relying on fewer and fewer advisors and aides and sort of a shrunken circle of loyal advisors. And I think it was Reuters who said he just listens to his own inner voice. So as much as there's some hope or glimmers of hope given the Lavrov-Kerry meetings, I do think there's such unpredictability and volatility in this situation that it's made it very difficult for the West to read it.
David, I wanted to ask you about something you said earlier. You said you spent the last couple of days with Henry Kissinger. What was that like, and how does he see all of this?
Well, this was a convocation at Yale University where Dr. Kissinger was given his papers, so there was an evening and then a day of discussion about Europe, principally about Ukraine. And Henry Kissinger is now over 90, but is the person I find most useful to listen to on crises like this because he's actually been there. He knows Vladimir Putin probably better than any American. And he kept coming back to the point that if you want to conduct diplomacy, you need to be able to see what your adversary is thinking so as to craft a response that asserts your interests but also listens to his. And we'll see tonight as Secretary Kerry meets with Lavrov, and tomorrow as we kind of try to understand what happened, whether this is one of those moments where we went from a very tense crisis with 50,000 troops on the border into a period of diplomacy where people tried to sort out the equities. But that's the kind of thing Kissinger was telling this audience we need to do more of.
Isn't it also Henry Kissinger who says we should not engage in any kind of intervention until we know how we want it to end, not how we want it to begin?
Yes.
And that's exactly where we are.
I would just suggest that I'm a big admirer of Henry Kissinger, but there's another view out there represented by Bob Gates, who was Secretary of Defense for 2 presidents in a row, including President Obama. And he feels that what we have to do is not only understand them, but we have to make them understand us. And that comes through action, not just speeches. We need a strategic long game that shows Putin over the long term, Russia will suffer. And he may be there for 10 more years under the Russian Constitution. Putin could be there for another 10 years. That he will suffer. And the Gates view is you've got to stand up to him now. But my personal view is I thought the president would make a surprise visit to Kiev this week. It just seemed to me that would rally the people of Ukraine, know that the Americans were with them, just as John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan did that in Berlin. But it also shows Putin, hey, look, we're not just patsies in this thing. We're not here just to negotiate a way for you to get an off-ramp and keep Crimea.
But wouldn't there be a risk that, given that Putin has suggested it's the West and the U.S. that has inspired what happened in Ukraine, if the president showed up there, would it be provocative?
Wouldn't that play into that argument?
I think it's really important to understand the mind of dictators, but you've also got to show them what you've got, what you're holding, what you're willing to do. That will influence what he thinks.
But I do think Putin, looking at what lies ahead, if he were to invade eastern Ukraine, if he were to move elsewhere, was looking at a pretty unappetizing set of choices. And I think the point that may be better to consolidate this, limited gain in Crimea, that leaves Ukraine as a whole moving west, which is a big change. I mean, I'd say, David, this is not as if Putin's walked off with the prize. Putin's walked off with a consolation prize.
How would you feel if, at the end of the day, he has Crimea and Ukraine's basically neutralized?
If it's neutralized but can become a member of the European Union, in other words, if it's not a NATO member.
What if you don't get either one of those things?
Well, then I'd say Ukrainians would be unhappy.
Oh.
Michael Hayden made an important point, which is this has got to be the Ukrainians' decision. They have elections coming up in May. They have a very vibrant competition going on right now, and if it looks like the U.S. is getting in the way even of Europe and getting in line ahead of Europe on this, I don't quite see what the gain is just to say that you stare down Vladimir Putin. Who, by the way, has bedeviled 3 U.S. presidents.
I want to talk about what's going to happen here in Washington for the rest of the year, because it looks to me like they basically closed up for serious business until after the election. I mean, the Senate, in its wisdom, has managed to, they're now pretty close to passing that $1 billion aid package for Ukraine, which they started in on when the president asked them to do that urgently, and they chose instead to go on vacation, which I can't imagine that generally helped things very much. What's going to happen here, Carolyn, between now and the election? Is anything going to happen?
Almost nothing. The midterms are beckoning. You saw the story about the Democrats have sort of laid out an agenda, not that they expect to pass, but the issues they intend to trumpet during the midterm elections. And it looks like hopes for immigration reform are all but dead. And it just seems like everybody has sort of accepted maybe this is the new normal, that they do very little.
No tax reform, also no entitlement reform. We've already gotten word on that. I mean, is that why we pay people to come and represent us in Washington, to spend a year preparing for the next election?
Are midterm elections ever a fruitful time for getting things done in midterm elections?
But it just seems to me like this is March.
We got tax reform done in 1986 with Reagan.
Some years there. Some years people want to show that they've been legislating on behalf of the public's interest. Right. What's sad is that people seem to think sitting on your hands is a better approach.
Well, when you ask, what's going to happen between now and the election, I thought you might be meaning 2016. I'm really worried we're not going to get much done for the next 3 years. I mean, I don't know about you. You're closer to this than I am.
Right, and also the sort of the interest in the 2016 narrative, to use that overused word, is sort of already overtaking this year. Will Hillary run, and what's going on with Republicans going down to Vegas? And there is a way that it's kind of started to eclipse everything else. So that is a little distressing too. And also, even the number of retirements and people announcing they're not going to run again, even in the middle of, this very important discussion of intelligence, Mike Rogers, you saw this week, is going to step down.
Well, what's happening over and over again is the serious people are saying, I just don't think it's worth my time anymore, which is an awful, to me, the worst indictment you can make of our political system right now, that people think they can get more done outside the United States Senate or and when they're not the chairman of a congressional committee. That's
think
the
with
part
Mike
that
Rogers,
I find
it may
really
be
bothers.
he's been a pretty successful legislator. He's made his committee work. It's a rare one in Congress that does. The bipartisan bill they just came out with on surveillance metadata is an example. I suspect Mike Rogers is looking for a way to get to a higher level, and he sees this as preferable for the moment to running for governor. Or something like
I sat down with people who recruit candidates to run for Congress, to run for the House and the Senate. And usually prospective candidates will ask things like, how do you raise money, or how do you deal with negative attacks? And now they ask questions like, why do you do this? Is there any joy? I mean, the whole notion of going to Washington and making a difference seems sort of...
Let me offer a counterintuitive, Pollyannish worldview, which is that the narrative of 2016 is racing ahead among us. We are very interested in what Jeb Bush is going to do. We're terribly interested in what Hillary Clinton's going to do. I don't think it's racing ahead among the American people. I would also say that in order to speak to the American people, the autopsy that the Republicans did a year ago still holds. Something, not much, perhaps something, at least talk has to happen on immigration reform. Some conversation has to happen. There's a reason why the White House is dancing so carefully about the continuing rollout of the health care exchanges. When they have good news, they run a lap. When they don't have good news, they put it off or delay it or put it down the road. Because it matters, because this actually resonates with people, and people think this may affect their lives and their pocketbooks. So I don't really think the politics of the thing can overwhelm everything for the next 3 years. I think bit by bit by bit, perhaps. I do agree that people are depressed about running for Congress.
Yeah, but I'm much more optimistic about the long term. But Bob, it's not just serious people are leaving. There are a lot of people coming up in the younger generation who one day would have, days past would have gone to Washington. They're increasingly disinterested in that. They want to become social entrepreneurs. They want to work in cities where they think they can get things done. And frankly, they're right.
Have you run into any grandmothers lately who hope their grandchild think he's going to be president someday?
No.
My grandmother thought that because all grandmothers in that day thought their grandson was going to grow up to be president. I don't hear anybody anymore saying, "Boy, I hope my kid gets into politics."
Probably somewhere Bill Clinton is saying it.
Let me talk to you about Chris Christie. So he hired some lawyers to investigate him, and they've exonerated him.
Oh, surprise!
Is that the end of this?
I don't think it's the end. I think this week you saw something very encouraging and something very discouraging about Chris Christie, who I do think is an unusually gifted politician. But this week you saw this report, despite its limitations, and they are many, give him sort of a clean bill of health. But then you saw him come out and talk to reporters, and suddenly the bombastic, belittling Chris Christie was back, and the more penitent, thoughtful, self-reflective Chris Christie had vaporized. And it really made you wonder about to what degree did he learn anything here? And those who support him thought this would be a moment where he would kind of come through and be a different.
But those who supported him liked the bombastic Chris Christie. They liked the guy who told reporters off. I mean, he comes out, he gets this exonerating report, then he immediately sits down with Diane Sawyer, he immediately sits down with Megyn Kelly, he immediately goes to the Republican Jewish Coalition and talks tough, and then says something about occupied territories, which kind of gets him in trouble. But that's always been his stock and trade. I am the tough talker, I'm going to tell you the truth. And I don't know that anybody who was going to write him a check before is going to be turned off by it suddenly now.
Bob, I sense, maybe Gwen, you just talked about Jeb Bush. I sense the boomlet about Jeb Bush is all about Chris Christie, because people thought they were going to ride the Chris Christie horse, and they now think that horse may be lame, and they're looking for somebody else. But what surprised me this week was the way this paid group went after the young woman, Bridget. They really threw her totally under the bus and treated her as a sexist kind of attack that you have to wonder if she's sitting there, and her lawyer has been very tough about it in response. If she's sitting on anything, she's going to go after him.
There are 2 more investigations still going on.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's the uncertain question. What does she know?
So what about Jeb Bush? Every report was that he was not going to do it. He'd made up his mind, but my sense is he's rethinking it.
If enough people ask you to do something, your firm no becomes a, well, gosh, let me think about it. I still think with Christie did what a big, powerful corporation does. Hired a bunch of lawyers, the lawyers issue a report, and then he says, in this sort of sharp encounter with reporters, let's move on. If he can make that work, and that's what we'll see over the next month or two, That's really a significant, I would say, achievement. He had a huge scandal that people said was the end. And if it proves not to be the end, I would suspect you'd begin to see some kind of reinterest in Christie.
But there are 2 other investigations underway, pretty serious ones. The legislature, there's a federal investigation. So it's not clear where those might go, and those seem more expansive than just looking more narrowly at the administration.
All right. We have to end it here. Thank you all so much. A lot of fun to talk to you, and we'll be right back.